Hello all, my name is Neil McGurk. I'm the Division Disaster Director for the state of Texas. I'm also a member of a collaborative team made up of members from volunteer services, disaster services within the Swarm Division that developed a new approach in tracking and identifying the true number of volunteers that are needed within the Swarm Division and in each region. So what I'm going to take you through on this presentation is a description and a demonstration of the staffing assessment tool that is currently being rolled out across the division, and that each region will be responsible for completing and submitting by the beginning of fiscal year 15 in early July. And so, but before I get to that tool, I want to take you through and set and clearly articulate some of the expectations regarding the usage of the tool and the usage of volunteer connection. So as we start to identify the overall direction for promoting overall volunteer growth, I wanted to establish some key expectations for each region. So the first one is that each region uses volunteer connection as it is designed and to its full potential, meaning that positions need to be input into volunteer connection, volunteers need to be managed within the system, and so and to not keep a separate tracking system for volunteer names and contact information and things like that. So I'll give you an example of one of the ways, one of the things that we've heard before. You know, we'll ask a question, or someone will ask a question, how many volunteers do you currently have available? And the answer will be from a local area. They'll say, well, Volunteer Connection says we have 1,000 volunteers, but in reality, 400. We actually have 400 volunteers. And that's the kind of thing we're trying to get away from. If we use Volunteer Connection as our official system of record, and as it is designed and to its full potential, then Volunteer Connection should actually say 400 volunteers if we're using it to its fullest potential. So again, that's the intention of that, is that we're not going to be tracking volunteers on a separate system, that Volunteer Connection is the system of record. And all volunteers need to be managed within Volunteer Connection and placed in positions that reflect their involvement with the organization. So I'll give you an example. If a volunteer is a member, a disaster action team member in a specific community, then they need to be assigned to that DAT team for that specific community and that position with which they are filling. If they're a member of a service of the armed forces and they're doing work within that area, then they need to be assigned to an SAF position. If they're also a receptionist, they answer the phones, then they need to be assigned to that position as well. So you can have volunteers that are assigned to multiple positions in Volunteer Connection, and what that will do, that gives you a better insight as to how that volunteer is engaged with the organization, and it's a true reflection of their involvement. And so it's not enough to just put them in the DAT position if they have all these other involvements, so they're in the system. You need to ensure that those volunteers are assigned to positions that reflect their true involvement with the organization. The other expectation is that regions need to identify the volunteer positions they need and the number of volunteers needed for each position. And this will be identified as we go through the staffing tool, but the premise of this is that each region needs to understand what they're going to recruit volunteers to do, so which positions they need filled by volunteers, and then how many volunteers they're needed for each of those positions. So I'll give you another example of what we're trying to get away from. In the past, a common statement that I think nearly all of us have said before is someone will ask the question, how many volunteers do you need? And the general answer is well, we need more. I need more volunteers. That's the general answer. But take that from someone in volunteer services, from their perspective, how do you recruit more volunteers? What is the measure of success? When have we reached more? The intention of this is to put some science behind it and some numbers behind it so that we understand that, so when volunteer services is asked to get volunteers, they're actually asked a specific number for a specific position in a specific area. So I need, if I'm looking, and let's say I'm in Central Texas and I need disaster action team members. Instead of saying I need more people, I can say I need 25 disaster action team members in the city of Austin. So that's a quantifiable number that volunteer services can then go out and develop tactics to recruit those 25 DAT members in Austin. They also know where the measure of success is. So they understand, well, when have we reached our target? Again, taking it out from the abstract and put it into something clearly defined so that we understand where the measure of success is. And another expectation is that we need to ensure that Volunteer Connection data is accurate. So the data that you pull out of Volunteer Connection is only going to be as good as the data that you put into Volunteer Connection. And so as part of the overall expectation is that regions will be required to review active volunteer rosters each quarter and archive inactive volunteers. So those are volunteers that have not placed at least 1 hour, have not volunteered at least 1 hour for the Red Cross in the previous year. But part of this review is not just about active volunteers, it's also about whether or not a volunteer is still filling a certain position. So I gave you that example earlier in the presentation about a volunteer that volunteers for DAT, SAF, and as a receptionist. So let's say that volunteer decides they no longer want to be a receptionist. And so they've ended their position for a receptionist. Now, our responsibility is, and this is one of the requirements that each quarter, regions have to ensure that their position data is accurate as well. So whoever is supervising that volunteer as a receptionist needs to ensure they've gone into Volunteer Connection and ended that position for that volunteer, so that when you run a report, it shows that the true reflection of that volunteer's activity with the organization, which is now they're a DAT member and they're an SAF member, and they're no longer still listed as a receptionist because they have ended that position within their profile. So that ensures that as we archive inactive volunteers and as we remove volunteers that are no longer active in certain positions, then that is reflected in Volunteer Connection. And while the organization sets the standard of a 1 hour a year equals an active volunteer, each region can determine how active a volunteer needs to be for certain positions. And that's going to vary by position by position. So there is no guideline for, what is considered active for a DAT member versus a receptionist versus something else. That's something that each region and each local area is going to have to decide based on individual positions. So now I'm going to take you through the staffing tool. And the first thing I wanted to mention is, before we go into the staffing tool, is that what you're going to see is actually it's made up of it's for demonstration purposes only at this point. The data that you'll be seeing within the tool is not actual data. It's been made up data for the demonstration. So don't read anything into it, especially if you're from the Gulf Coast region. You're going to see it. The demonstration is using highlighting the Gulf Coast region. The positions that are illustrated are not actual positions, so don't lose any sleep over it. So we'll just give one moment. Let me pull up the Excel document. And so here we have the Excel document. So again, for demonstration purposes only, we use the Texas Gulf Coast region. And the first column here identifies volunteer positions. And so, as we mentioned earlier, volunteer positions that have geographic or local responsibilities need to have specific positions associated with them. So our disaster action team is a great example of positions that are locally based. And so you need to have positions for each of your disaster action teams if you are managing them in that method. So we have our disaster action team in the community of Lufkin, and then associated positions. So for the demonstration purposes, we have a coordinator position, a captain position, a team member position, and then we have the same positions but for Waller County in the Texas Gulf Coast region. So again, because it's geographically based, then we have separate positions because these are going to be separate needs within the organization. Then we'll scroll down. We have some mass care action team positions, government liaison positions, and then because this tool is not just designed for disaster services, it's designed to be a full cycle, it's supposed to be for all lines of service, that we have service of the armed forces positions listed in here, international positions, financial development, preparedness, health, and safety positions. So again, any position with which you're going to be recruiting volunteers for, you need to have it reflected in this spreadsheet. And don't worry, it's actually very easy to enter this data into the spreadsheet. There are reports that you can run in Volunteer Connection that will do sort of a raw data report of all of your positions that you can simply just copy and paste into the system. So it's not a matter, don't worry about having to type in 500 lines and 500 different positions. You really have it really easy to do with some quick and easy reports in Volunteer Connection. So the next line over is the position point of contact. So we have our disaster action team position over here. And so for each of these positions for the disaster action team in Lufkin has a unique point of contact. Now, the intention of this point of contact is to either be a leadership volunteer or for the disaster services anyway, it's the disaster program specialist or the program manager. And it's really the individual who has responsibility for placing volunteers in these positions within Volunteer Connection. So it's the person administering the overall group. So is who the position point of contact is supposed to be. Then you have the volunteer support, volunteer services support person. This is somebody within volunteer services that is providing support to the position point of contact for this overall team. And the reason these are both here, both of these position point of contact and the support, is because the work of managing a volunteer within Volunteer Connection or anywhere else is a collaborative responsibility between both the individual department and volunteer services. So there are two people on this that are responsible for the maintenance of this overall team within the area. The next column over here is the need. So this is one of the responsibilities of each department. So it's not a responsibility of volunteer services, but each department, so we're going to take disaster services, is responsible for identifying what the positions they need. So they've identified they need the disaster action team as well as these positions. Then they have to identify the number of volunteers that are needed for each position. And so here, John Walker, and collaboratively with his supervisor or his leadership team, whomever, have decided that over here they need these numbers of people for each of their positions within their area. So these are locally developed numbers based on conversations and based on overall need and disaster responses and things like that. So John Walker and his team have developed these overall numbers. So we've done these for all the positions. So each position point of contact is responsible, or each department is responsible for submitting the need to volunteer services within this area. And so the next component I'm going to talk about establishing the baseline. And before I do that, I want to talk to you a little bit about some methods that we're taking at the division to ensure that we're not adding an undue amount of burden on regions through the maintenance and keeping of this tracking tool. The first is that there is going to be a little bit of a lift at the beginning of the year to track and get all this data entered in on the spreadsheet. This is for the positions over here, the position point of contact, but the biggest lift is actually going to be your assessment, how many volunteers you're going to be needing. Then, and again, this is the only fiscal year we just need to assign this need, and you can add in more or edit as the year goes on and things like that, so you're not tied into this number, because again, this is a tool that is meant to be of benefit and service to you all, so you can change some of these numbers as they go along. But again, the beginning of the year is where you're really going to spend some time to identify your need. But then we are presenting the option to each region to basically outsource to a couple of volunteers at the division the data management and the data analysis. So really, I describe what that process looks like. So when you want to establish your baseline, which is establishing how many volunteers are currently assigned to each of these positions in Volunteer Connection, really involves this. You can either completely do this in-house if you choose to do it within your individual regions, or the volunteer services can run a complete raw data position report, submit it to our volunteer data analysts at the division, and then the volunteer data analyst will analyze the data and will enter in your baseline and send you a completed form back. So again, we looked at what the greatest time spent on this form would be, and that would be in the data analysis of deciding your baseline, as well as additional quarterly reporting, which I'll talk to you in a moment. And we determined that we can identify a few key volunteers that really enjoy working with data manage them at the division level and really provide that service to the regions. So again, you all can use this spreadsheet as a management tool for you all without placing a significant burden on you or your volunteers or staff that are working within your departments. And this is for volunteer services. So again, if you choose to outsource the data to the division data analyst, you'll provide that raw data report. The data analyst will enter in all the information here that you're seeing here. We'll count up how many volunteers are assigned to each position, and then we'll send you back your completed report. The blue columns over here represent automatic calculations, and so they're based on the need and your baseline, which will identify your shortfall. So as you can see here, we've got the Lufkin team member. You need 15 people for that position, but you currently only have 10 assigned in volunteer connection. And for an individual to be counted in your baseline, they have to be currently assigned to that position in volunteer connection. And then you have a position shortfall of 5, or which represents 67% of your positions are filled within that area. You will notice that down here we have a need for the team member in training. We have a need for 6 positions, but we have a baseline of 23, so we have 23 volunteers that are currently assigned to that position, but your shortfall is still 0. So there is not credit given for overages or excesses, and that's because it will skew off the total data at the end of the report for the overall region, and I'll show that here in a moment. So you establish your baseline at the beginning of the year, and then each quarter, each region is required to, will run that data again, that raw data report, to identify every quarter how many volunteers are assigned to those positions. So here's the thought and intention on this, that as you are getting more volunteers in the organization and as they are being placed in positions, then your numbers are obviously going to change. But similarly, as volunteers leave positions, as they either leave the organization or they decide they don't want to be a DAP member or a receptionist any longer, and they remove themselves out of that position, then as the position point of contact removes those individuals from the positions in volunteer connection, the numbers will change. And so you have your snapshot at the beginning of the year, and then each quarter you'll have a quarterly snapshot. And again, this is going to be really easy to gather this quarterly data, especially if you outsource it to the division data analyst. So again, you run a raw data report. It takes about 2 minutes. You submit it up to the division, and the division data analyst will return your completed report back to you that highlights how many volunteers are currently in those positions. Now, every quarter, it's a responsibility for the position point of contact to certify that, 1, they have been placing new volunteers in the positions, but they have also been removing volunteers from the positions that are no longer interested or fulfilling the obligations within those positions. So basically, each quarter, Susie Timmons or Fred Sanford or Julie Haynes have a responsibility to ensure that, to basically certify that their positions are up to date, that volunteers have been added and volunteers have been taken away and removed from positions as they are no longer interested in fulfilling those roles, which happens. And so then we'll get those current data. So as you can see here, John Walker needed 1 coordinator at the beginning of the year. There was 1 coordinator assigned to that position, but that coordinator left the organization before the end of the first quarter. So again, clear data has been left here. So you went from a position with no shortfalls to a position with 1 shortfall. And the goal here is to have a consistent upward trend. So we need to be bringing in more people and retaining more people than we lose. So this spreadsheet will give us an overall method for tracking that information. So down here at the bottom of the page, these are overall results. So at the beginning of the year in July of 2014, because again, the intention of this is to go live with this spreadsheet and begin utilizing the spreadsheet at the beginning of the fiscal year, FY15, for each region in the division. So the total shortfall for this demonstration purposes was 153 positions. So there are 153 positions that still needed to be filled, which represents that 53.8% of positions currently are filled. So the region using these numbers would then set an overall growth goal. So the goal would be well, let's say we want by the end of the year we want to have 60% of positions filled. So then by tracking the information and removing volunteers out that are no longer active and adding volunteers that are newly recruited, then we'll be able to then track the total number of shortfalls as well as the positions filled. So again, by the end of the year, they need to be at 60%. So we see they've reduced their shortfalls in the first and second quarter, and they're actually at 60% in the second quarter for the positions filled, but they need to be at least 60% by the end of the year. And so in the third quarter, they've actually lost more people than they've brought in and placed in position. So you can see that shortfall goes up a little bit, and the percentage of positions filled goes down. But then they were able to recruit more people, and then by the end of the year, they're at 62.2%. So you can see, again, the positions filled goes consistently up, a little bit of a dip down in the third quarter, and then back up. So again, the data is only as good as how the data is being managed within Volunteer Connection, and that will be an expectation is that those position point of contacts are managing their data completely. So this is just an overall demonstration of the main component of the spreadsheet. There'll be more information that is coming out or that will be released regarding overall implementation as well as support, resources, and other guidance regarding full implementation of this tool. But thank you for taking the time and listening to this presentation. I hope you have a great rest of your day.